Hi, I'm Rudy Valdez, and I lead our solution architecture and training and certification efforts at AWS. Today I'd like to talk to you about the evolution of cloud architecture. Before we jump in, I'd like to share a little bit of information about myself. So I've been at AWS for just over 15 years, since 2005, and that predates when we launched the first AWS services. Here I'm showing with my colleague Jeff Barr, who's our chief evangelist, at the first trade show that we attended as AWS. You can see a pretty modest booth there. I think that was the entire AWS presence at that event. If you look at the AWS platform around the same time, this is probably a 2009 screenshot, you can see a pretty modest platform as well. So here you see, I think, 6 infrastructure services that we had at the time. And at that time, it was relatively easy to wrap your head around 6 services. As an architect, we could get deep on those and help customers build and utilize those services in their applications. So that's exactly what we did. In 2009, we started the solution architecture function. We hired a bunch of chief technology officers, lead architects, chief architects, lead developers, and so on. And we brought them on board and we visited customers and we whiteboarded with customers about architectural approaches. What are the trade-offs to make in building systems on the AWS cloud? But that was 10 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. So in this talk, I'd like to take you through some observations about that change. First of all, I'll talk about the formalization of best practices, and in particular, the well-architected framework. Second, we'll talk about the customer base and how that has changed over time and how that has changed the way that we approach architectural design. And then finally, we'll talk about the continued growth of the AWS platform and what that means from a specialized talent capability. So we'll start off with our first observation, and that is that not all cloud architectures are created equal. So in 2012, we had a service disruption, and as part of any service disruption, we go through a COE process, a correction of error process internally. And the idea there is that we want to drill down and understand the root cause of the service disruption. And then we also want to think about mechanisms that we can put in place to guard against that happening in the future. So as part of that process, we were looking at the customers and how they were impacted by this event. And we found out that a portion of the customers actually did fine. Their systems remained up. They didn't show any visible sign of impact. And another set of customers did not do so well. And so we asked ourselves, what differentiated those two sets of customers? And what we found out was that the customers who were following our architectural best practices that we were espousing in the field were the ones that did well in that event. And the ones that we had not talked to or that did not follow those practices didn't do so well. At the time, we were sharing these best practices through tribal knowledge. One solution architect would tell another, right? They would share best practices. We'd go out to customers and partners and we'd share that as well. But we found that it wasn't a great way of kind of having consistency. So one architect may say one thing and the second solution architect may have a slightly different bit of guidance, or uniformity, right? Because we could only talk to a certain number of customers and the ones that we didn't talk to were not getting this information. So we tried to figure out how do we solve that problem. So we gathered up our best solution architects, put them in a room, and we decided, let's write down these best practices, right? And so for months, our architects worked and generated kind of the best set of practices that we had at the time and put them into a paper called the Well-Architected Framework. This is a paper we launched in October 2015. So let's step back and look at the Well-Architected Framework. So the Well-Architected Framework consists of pillars, each in a particular architectural area, such as security, reliability, performance efficiency, cost efficiency, and so on. But each of these pillars has a set of questions, and the idea behind these questions is to ascertain whether a particular workload is well architected with respect to that particular pillar area. When you conduct these reviews yield issues, right? You can find issues with your architecture. The most severe of these are, we term high-risk issues, or HRIs. And these are lists of things you would want to repair within your application to help improve the well-architectedness of that workload. So if you look at the well-architected ecosystem, it consists of two halves. On the left-hand side here, we're showing customers who have adopted the well-architected methodology into their application development practice. So for example, Cox Automotive, when they were migrating their applications to the cloud, they were utilizing the well-architected framework to do these assessments on those workloads as they migrated them, improving their security, their reliability, their operational efficiency, and so on. They later started using that methodology in their new application development as well. So in that case, they were baking in all these good attributes into their applications up front, realizing the value very early in the life cycle. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you see our well-architected partners. And these are systems integrators or APN consulting partners who have integrated well-architected methodology and practice into their consulting practice. So for example, Slalom is a longtime partner of AWS. They were looking for new business opportunity, and they were utilizing the well-architected reviews as a way of doing a couple things. One is that they would establish technical credibility with their potential customer, right? Because they were reviewing workloads and saying, hey, here's an architectural weakness in that design. But furthermore, they were encouraging new business, right? Because those issues that you find, you have to remediate them, right? And that's consulting work. And Slalom was winning new business as a result of this practice. So very good for both the customer and the consulting partner. So we've been doing well-architected reviews for about 9 years now. What have we learned over that period? So this slide shows the number of well-architected reviews we've conducted. And we've conducted hundreds of thousands of well-architected reviews over the last few years. So I mentioned we started the practice in 2012 internally and drove it for several years that way. But in 2015, we started working with consulting partners and helped them integrate that practice into their consulting practice. You can see on the graph here, 2015, 16, and 17, the curve starts to raise off the floor there, right? And so we're getting a lot of scale by not only doing reviews ourselves, but doing those through consulting partners. In 2018, particularly at re:Invent, we launched the well-architected tool. And this, for the first time, put a systematic way of managing reviews and remediating any issues found in the hands of both ourselves internally, but also in consulting partners, our well-architected partners, and most importantly, in the hands of customers directly, right? So for the first time, customers could run reviews with tooling support and remediate those issues themselves. You'll see a huge jump in the number of reviews being conducted during that time period, right? An order of magnitude leap by democratizing that tooling access. We're also looking at the number of high-risk issues that are found. So the scale is different. In fact, the scale, we're finding about 14 high-risk issues per workload reviewed. But the shape of the curve is the same, right? So it's showing us that those two lines are growing proportional with each other. You're finding roughly the same amount of issues per workload review over time. As I mentioned, we've done hundreds of thousands of reviews, right? And we've been able to aggregate that data and look at that anonymously. And you can see this graph shows high-risk issues that have been resolved, right? And you can see those are roughly evenly distributed across the 5 pillars that have been in existence up until now. That's showing a few things, right? One is that the framework itself is getting kind of uniform play across the different pillars. No one pillar is, that much more important than the other. So very good data to kind of look at, and it shows kind of a balanced framework, if you will. What else have we learned? Another thing we learned is that a one-size-fits-all framework is not particularly useful for all workloads. So for example, when we launched Lambda, our serverless offering, there was a different set of questions you'd want to ask about a serverless workload, for example. So starting in 2017, we started launching what we call well-architected lenses. So a lens is basically an overlay on top of the baseline framework that asks additional questions that are relevant to that particular workload type. So we've launched industry vertical lenses, such as financial services, and we've launched lenses that are particular to a technology area, like analytics, machine learning, serverless, and so on. Here at re:Invent, we're launching 2 additional lenses. The first is a software as a service lens. This helps our partners who are building SaaS applications to verify their solutions against the framework. And then we're also launching a foundational technical review lens, and this helps our APN partners conform to requirements that are part of our APN programs. So how has the framework and the initiative evolved over time? In 2012, that's when we started using the framework internally. 2015 is when we launched the white paper that defined the framework publicly for the first time. And is also when we started working with consulting partners to institute that as part of their practices. In 2016, we added our first new pillar, and this was the operational excellence pillar. So here we partnered with the AWS support organization in gathering up what are the best operational practices that customers were having to managing their workloads that were on the cloud. And we constituted that as part of the pillar. And then in 2018, as I mentioned, we launched the well-architected tool externally. So if we look at 2020, earlier in the year, we launched the well-architected framework version 8. So this is the 8th major iteration we've had on the framework. And this is important in that over time, best practices change, and we're continually looking at the framework pillar by pillar to make sure that we're adjusting and updating the guidance that we're giving to customers. We've also launched 3 new lenses. So we launched a lens for financial services, our serverless lens, and a machine learning lens. The serverless lens in particular is getting a tremendous amount of play. And this is signaling that people are building more and more serverless applications out in the field. So here in re:Invent, we're launching 2 additional lenses, as I mentioned, our SaaS lens and our technical foundation lens. So what else is missing? We at AWS listen to customers all the time. We're always wanting to hear what they need, and it's no different in the well-architected space. Many of our customers were saying that, hey, I love the well-architected framework. We've implemented it as part of our application development methodology, but I have other frameworks that I need to meet, other compliance measures and so on. It would be really nice to kind of manage that in one spot. They were also saying that, as I fill out these reviews and answer these questions, a lot of that data is sitting in external systems, right? I would love the ability to kind of bring that data into the well-architected tool, utilize it there, and so on. And then finally, they were saying that well-architected tool, that has a lot of review data, a lot of information in there. I would love to bring that data outside of the tool and use it in other systems. So I'm very pleased to announce today that we're launching the well-architected tool APIs. So this has been a long time coming, but very pleased to have it available today. This gives you APIs that let you do exactly what I mentioned, right? You can bring data from outside into the tool, and you can also publish that data externally. So let's walk through that and see what that looks like. We envision 2 primary types of use cases. One is about bringing data into the platform. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of external third-party monitoring tools, security tools, and so on. And it'd be very good to kind of have those tools have the ability to create reviews and maybe pre-populate those review questions with relevant data, or assist in answering those review questions, or maybe even remediating any issues found with that. The second category of use cases we see is about taking well-architected data and bringing it into external systems. So for example, you may have an application that does analysis on risk management, right? And maybe that's a company-wide offering that you have. It'd be very nice to have your well-architected data available to use in that scenario. Second, there's a lot of workflow applications, right? So maybe your process is that when you find a high-risk issue in one of your well-architected reviews, you cut a ticket to a development team to work on that issue, maybe in an external ticketing system. So again, it'd be nice to have integration between those two tools. So we're launching with a number of partners today. I'll talk about a few of them. NOPS, for example, their solution runs within the customer's target workload environment, and it's continually monitoring their system to see if they comply with a well-architected framework. And the nice thing is they operate with a well-architected framework, right, the AWS framework, but they also support other compliance and regulatory requirements. So for example, they support HIPAA for healthcare apps as well as SOC 2. They provide a real-time dashboard where you can drill down on a resource basis to investigate any issues found and find root cause analysis. The second integration is the Turbot solution. So their solution has 7,000 governance guardrails that check a number of things. And all these guardrails are aligned to the well-architected framework pillars. So it enables you to discover violations against that framework, and in some cases, even remediate the issue in an automated fashion. So I'd like to welcome Steve Kwan. He's from Trend Micro, and they're going to talk about their integration with the well-architected APIs.
Thank you, Rudy. Hi, I'm Steve from Trend Micro. We have a SaaS application sitting in AWS platform, and we're a very happy customer. And what we do in that application is we provide security services for many, many entities, both in the cloud and on-premise. So that's everything from an EC2 to an S3 bucket to load balancers to network security as well. And so we have been working with Amazon for about 9 years now and working to optimize that application, not only for our customers, but for performance and architecture and all the things that AWS helps us with on the SaaS performance side. So one thing that we've been very enamored with lately is the well-architected framework, and it really came through our customer base that we kind of started engaging with this framework. And most of our customers came to us and they said, I really like that you provide these services, but is there any way that you could align that with the well-architected framework? And so that's essentially customers saying, I have custom compliance requirements, I've got industry regulations, so can I take those compliance requirements, do your security services, and then have all that lined up with the well-architected framework? So we've done that. We have a service called Cloud One Conformity. It's essentially security services and performance and optimization services that look at your AWS services and judge whether or not they are configured correctly, both to custom enterprise compliance as well as industry or security best practice. So for instance, going back to that S3 bucket, oftentimes we'll see S3 buckets that are public and open to the environment, and a lot of customers consider that a significant security violation. And so we'll detect that with our service. Same thing with an EC2. Maybe the access control list is configured by an outside source. That seems odd. So that's probably a security violation. So what we do is we look at all the services in Amazon. We select certain ones that are high security risks, and we report back on their configuration. Once again, both match to custom compliance requirements, industry compliance requirements, as well as best practice for security and performance. Then we take that and we match it to the well-architected framework. And the reason we do that is our customers say, I have a really hard time with my skill sets and my people really understanding where to tune my cloud environment. And so the well-architected framework puts in very, very detailed and insightful parameters for me to tune my environment. And Trend Micro, if you could match your security configuration data to that, that would be super helpful. So let me show you our dashboard in our service called Cloud One Conformity. Once again, it's a posture management configuration service. If you look in the upper left, you'll see all of the Amazon accounts, or you can individually select them one by one. But the main dashboard here is configurations matched to the 5 pillars of the well-architected framework. So you can see, you can look at each pillar, take the security data that we've provided and configuration data, and then match that. How's my performance? settings? How are my security settings? And then you can click on them and go deeper and configure and remediate, oftentimes in a very automated way through things like ServiceNow or Microsoft Teams, or any workflow application that you have. And then probably the most important feature, we switched to now this graph shows you a customer's compliance over time. So maybe the numbers mean a lot or little to you, but you can actually say, am I getting better at my security profile? Am I getting better at my performance and optimization characteristics? And so our relationship between the customer, between AWS and between Trend Micro, all built around the well-architected framework, as well as the API enhancements that are having, is just making this simpler, easier, faster, and more automated for the customer. And ultimately, they can also go deeper and deeper and deeper to help tune those 5 pillars, both based on configurations and the parameters that are coming through the APIs from AWS. So we are a very happy AWS SaaS customer. We've been on the platform forever. We are at massive scale. And the well-architected framework has really helped create a language and a system for helping our customers make sure their environment is safe, secure, and performing well. And our security services are configured, capturing the right data, and ensuring that the applications and outcomes that we're trying to achieve as business owners are correct. So thank you so much. We love the well-architected framework, and we love the API enhancements that have come out recently with this launch.
Thanks, Steve. Very exciting to see what Trend Micro is doing with the well-architected APIs. This is a great example of leveraging the security expertise of a company like Trend Micro in the well-architected environment. That brings us to our second observation, and that is that as customers change, so do the ways that they consume the cloud, right? And that does have architectural implications as well, as we'll see. So when we started AWS, many of our customers were startup customers. And this was a unique customer segment in many ways. I think the startup segment adopted the cloud first because the value prop was so strong to the startup companies. One is that it offered a fast time to market, right? There was pay for what you use and pay for nothing up front, right? And then there was the ability to scale, globally if your application was successful in the marketplace. But these customers, it was interesting in several ways, right? They were very technically savvy. So I had many conversations with startup customers, and they were technically deep, definitely understood web services, were very comfortable reading technical documentation, making API calls directly, utilizing our SDKs and so on. And as we grew the business, we started moving into mainstream adoption, right? And the customer types changed a little bit, right? We started seeing adoption from enterprises, for example. And the challenges that they see were just different than what we saw with startups. So I'd like to talk about 4 particular areas where we saw differences. First of all is the skills gap, right? I mentioned the startup customers, very technically savvy in most cases, but that's hard to say for very large enterprises, right? You have a whole mix of talent there, and not everyone is kind of cloud oriented. So you have what's called a skills gap. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, enterprises brought a migration challenge, right, to the game. So in the startup's case, they typically had a handful of applications. Many of them were already architected in terms of microservices, right? So moving to the cloud was a very easy move for applications like that. There were very few kind of data centers or legacy data centers to deal with, right? Most of them were at hosting companies, that type of thing. So the migration to cloud, again, was very easy. The third area we'll talk about is what we call the rise of managed services. So the idea here is that the way that you interact with a service continues to elevate in terms of the level of abstraction by which you're doing so. And then finally, we'll talk about what we call pre-built solutions. So there was an appetite to utilize things that had already been built versus building everything from the ground up. So let's jump into that first one, the so-called skills gap. IDC estimates that in 2022, up to 30% of global IT jobs will go unfilled, right? And this is largely because there's not enough talent to fill those jobs, right? Talent that is cloud savvy. So AWS ourselves, we train millions of people a year on cloud, right? But even at that rate, and that combined with all of our partners, our training partners, the skill gap is growing, right? There are more and more jobs, and that is outstripping the supply of available talent. So we're doing a couple things to help with this. First of all, we've invested very heavily in our AWS digital training platform. So these are online training modules that you can take. There's a large collection of them, very low cost, and in many cases free, that will give you training on very specific domain topics, right? If you need to learn real-time streaming with Kinesis, right, we have training on that specific topic. The nice thing about digital training, it also is available as you need it, right? You can take training over the weekend, or you can, if you have 30 minutes during lunch, you can take a training module and so on. So it's very amenable to work with you and adapt to your needs and availability. The second thing we're doing here is something called the AWS Skills Guild. So over the last 10 years, we've been working with enterprise customers, figuring out how they best transform and how they best develop cloud competency within their organizations. And we've collected all those best practices up into an offering we call the Skills Guild. So this looks at an enterprise comprehensively and develops a custom plan for that enterprise and how they transform and develop skill competency within their organization. The second area we talked about is the migration scenario where, again, startups have very few apps, not much to migrate. Enterprises, on the other hand, have a ton of stuff, right? They've been in business for a long time. They have a lot of legacy and existing systems, and their applications may not be architected with, microservices, for example. And they may have dependencies on infrastructure or systems that are on premises, right? So it's a much more challenging migration, and the scale is just different, right? There are thousands of these workloads to migrate. So here again, we have adapted ourselves, right, to better support customers in this situation. So for example, one of the services that we have is the AWS Application Discovery Service, and this service will go onto your on-premises network and discover, like, what applications do I have living there? What is the server makeup of those applications? What are the relationships between those servers, right? All that is data that is very useful in your migration plan. And you can decide, for example, which workloads to start migrating first and which to do later, and so on. Another field offering that we have that assists with this problem is our Migration Acceleration Program, or our MAP program. Here we provide consulting support, training, and service credits to de-risk migrating to the cloud, to build a strong operational framework within the organization, and to help offset the initial cost of that migration. So again, we're adapting kind of our architectural approach to address this newer need. Another area we've seen change architecturally is in what services we provide and how they're consumed. So for example, in the very early days, when a customer had a high-scale web application and had to do load balancing in front of that, our solution architects would sit down and work with them and take software packages like HAProxy or Nginx, and we would help the customer build out the load balancing cluster in front of their application. So we did that enough, over the years that, we eventually just said, hey, we can probably build a service to do this on behalf of the customer, right? Not everyone wants to build a load balancing capability from the ground up every time. Let's just provide a service that does that on their behalf. Again, it's an efficiency win for the customer. Similar for Hadoop clusters, right? For many years, we consulted with customers on how do you spin up a Hadoop cluster, right? And how do you manage that yourself? And what are the best practices involved there? But eventually, we just built services to do that, right? So a customer today can walk in and use a service like Amazon Elastic MapReduce, and all that heavy lifting is done for them. Lastly, another example is Amazon RDS, right? So from the early days, again, people ran database services, but they managed those servers and patched those database servers themselves, right? And clustered them and all of that. Where again, we can just, remove some of that heavy lifting and do it on the customer's behalf, and that's a win for everyone. The last area I'll talk about is the appetite for pre-built solutions. So again, what we discovered in the field with our solution architect team was we were consulting on the same use cases over and over. So for example, we would go to a media company and they would want to build let's say a media transcoding farm, right? And we'd done that before. We've done it with many other customers. We knew the best practices around that. We knew the architectural blueprint, if you will, to do that. And we would, give them that advice and consult with them. But over time, we found that, we should just really kind of build a prepackaged solution to do this, right? And we can publish that. And then media companies, the ones we talk to and work with directly, but also the broader, longer tail media companies, they can just pick this off the shelf and use that as a starting point for their solution. So in 2017, we started our AWS Solutions efforts. So let's look at what is in the library of that offering. So the first thing is our solution implementations. Now these are the CloudFormation templates that you can download, instantiate in your account and instantiate your solution right within your AWS account. There are several hundred of these now. We'll look at them in more detail. In 2020, we also introduced two new concepts. One is AWS Solutions Constructs, and the second is AWS Consulting Offers. We'll talk about those in just a moment. But first, let's look at the AWS solution implementations. So this graph shows all of the solutions that we published in the early years. Our first solution that we built was a solution called Transit VPC. So prior to this, a lot of enterprises were spinning up virtual private clouds or VPCs within their environment. And there was no easy way to connect them or to route traffic amongst them. So we came up with a solution called Transit VPC that creates a new VPC that serves as a centralized transit center, if you will, that can route traffic and connect to all of those different VPCs within the enterprise organization. This solution, a couple years later, actually became an AWS service. It served as the underpinnings for the Transit Gateway service that we launched a couple years later. We were also packaging up ISV solutions. So in this case, we were working with a customer, Deutsche Bahn, and they were spinning up Red Hat OpenShift clusters. And they had a DevOps team that would spin up a new cluster anytime one of their development teams asked for that, and it would take them about a day to do so. And then when the development team was done with that cluster, they would tear it down, also taking some time. We worked with them and we migrated them to the Red Hat OpenShift solution offering from AWS. And now utilizing that, they were able to spin up clusters in minutes versus the day it was taking them to do so before, saving them 95% of operational cost in that effort. So that kind of speaks to the value of solutions, right? It's all about leveraging the work that another team has done in order to move faster. Finally, we started building industry vertical solutions, and these are indicated by blue labels on the slide here. One of the first ones we built was the connected vehicle solution. So the connected vehicle solution is utilized by automotive manufacturers and suppliers to build IoT environments that will take IoT data from their devices. In this case, it's connected vehicles. It would collect that data, it would analyze that data, and it would act on that data, all on a serverless architecture. And this is, you get this entire implementation for free, right? You download it and inflate it in your account. And then you do customization on the back end of that. But again, a huge savings in the amount of development effort required. If you look at this slide, you see when we released each of these solutions. They're kind of distributed over time over the last few years. But you also see the number of deployments. So these solutions are being deployed hundreds of thousands of times. So you get great scale with this type of approach. You can also see the curve, right? The curve is exponential, right? Meaning that adoption is actually accelerating on this. So we really feel that it has really met the need that customers were asking for as years prior. So let's go through a specific example of a solution being used by a customer. So App8 is an ISV who they service, their customers are restaurants, right? And they build a platform that assists in contactless ordering. So if you go into a restaurant that's supported by App8, you can browse the menu using your phone or mobile device. You can order based off, using that phone as well. And then when the bill comes, you can pay the bill using your phone as well. So as you can imagine, in the COVID crisis, the App8 service was in high demand, right? Their business spiked. And their development teams were trying to build a forecasting capability within their offering. So they had spent 5 months trying to build out this forecasting mechanism. But we introduced them to a solution. It's the Improving Forecasting Accuracy with Machine Learning solution that AWS provides. And within hours, they were able to start generating forecasts for their customers. Again, a huge efficiency gain for customers like that. So I mentioned solution constructs as something we introduced in 2020. Let me walk you through what those things are. So as we were building out our portfolio of solutions internally within AWS, we noticed that we were rebuilding a lot of the componentry over and over again, across different solutions. And so as an efficiency play, we started building solution constructs so that we didn't have to rebuild the same component over and over. We could just build the construct once and then utilize it in a number of solutions. But once we did that, that same value applies to our partner and our customer ecosystem as well. So we started publishing solution constructs so that partners could take these same components, put them into their solutions that they were building, or customers could do the same. So here's an example construct. You see on the left-hand side of the slide, we have an interaction between 3 services. Here we're taking a CloudFront, data coming in from a CloudFront distribution, running that through the Amazon API gateway, and finally invoking Lambda functions based off that data. So that's a component, right? You can build that component once, put that together, and utilize that in a number of solutions that needs that interaction pattern. Similarly, on the right-hand side of the slide, you see Lambda functions invoking writes into an S3 bucket. Again, that's a very common interaction pattern. You can package that up in a solution construct and utilize that in many places. So our solution implementations, one thing we discovered is that, they're really what we call 90% solutions, right? They'll get you 90% of the way there, but there's always this last mile of configuration or integration work that needs to occur within a customer environment. So our customers were saying, hey, I love your solution, but I really need help in kind of getting that last mile done. So we came up with an offering called AWS Solution Consulting Offers, where we take a solution in the marketplace, but we wrap a consulting offer around that. And these are APN competency partners that are particularly skilled in those solutions, right? Either they developed the solutions themselves, perhaps, or they just developed competency in that particular area. So a good example of this is Cloudwick. So they have a data lake as a service offering called Amorphic. And customers are welcome to buy that and deploy that themselves, but Cloudwick offers consulting services around that solution as well, right? So they can come in, meet with your development teams, understand the business use case, figure out the business and technical requirements, figure out what the success criteria you're looking for that work is, and then sit down with you and do that work directly, right? And we find that leads to a much more high likelihood of success with that solution. Another example is Link, who provides an SAP add-on called the AWS Connector for SAP. So for SAP customers, this treats the AWS service set as extensions that they can leverage within their SAP applications. And again, Link wraps this solution offering with consulting help, right? They're experts in that particular solution. They can help you get that last mile and be successful in your implementation. That brings us to our third observation. And that is that the requirement for specialization is something that's here to stay. So let me walk through what I mean by that. Earlier today, I showed a screenshot of the AWS platform circa 2009, where we had just a handful of infrastructure services available. We are moving from an environment like that, where you can have one person kind of deeply understand that entire portfolio, to this, where you have hundreds of services, right? And a lot of these services, are pretty sophisticated, right? They require a high level of specialized expertise to utilize and get the most value out of. Let's look at the database space in particular. So as you know, AWS has a purpose-built database strategy, right? We provide upwards of 14 database services that are very tuned to the use case, right? Relational databases, graph databases, ledger databases, and so on. So as an architect, having a skill set, let's say, with respect to Aurora RDS, right? That is a very different skill set than having expertise in DynamoDB or having expertise in our graph database Neptune, right? It's just a different skill set, a different methodology, and you need to have, that particular level of depth. So we've gotten very good at embracing that model within AWS. So, for example, we built systems that will help you find a subject matter expert anywhere in the world for a particular situation. So, for example, the way we use it internally is, I have a customer in New York City who has a Kinesis use case, and it's a French company, and they only speak French, right? I need a French-speaking solution architect who knows Kinesis deeply to assist with that. And we're able to find, who is available next Tuesday to talk with this customer, that type of thing. So we've gone to great lengths to bring, specialized expertise into our sales cycles. And I think, customers and enterprises will need to do that too, right? You'll need to develop and embrace the level of specialization required because it is a big, broad space, and AWS will continue to innovate and introduce new services and new features into the platform. So I spent a few minutes talking about architecture and approaches over the last 10 years and what that looks like. Let's look forward. I'll kind of dive into those three areas that we looked at, and let's see what's down the pike. So first of all, in the architectural best practices space, and in particular with respect to the well-architected framework and tool, we will continue to see automation there. So for example, I talked about the well-architected APIs that we announced today. Ourselves and third-party ISVs will continue to build integrations into that system, right? And again, there's the value that's happening there is they're bringing external data into the well-architected review process and populating those reviews with useful information, right? Answers to review questions or information on how to remediate those issues that are found, that type of thing. So that'll be a primary area of focus for both ourselves and our ISV partners going forward. The second area where we'll see some investment and some change is around custom best practices. So this is probably one of the number one or two things that customers have also been asking us for. They tell us stories like, hey, I have a compliance framework that I need to adhere to, but I also want to adhere to the well-architected best practices. How can I manage that world in one screen, right? In a single review, not two separate reviews that I have to merge together. So we will be introducing, in the same way that we've introduced custom questions into the review process via well-architected lenses, we will also be allowing customers to inject their own custom questions or best practices into the system, be it from external frameworks or maybe just organizational frameworks that they've come up with. I've also talked a little bit about the level of abstraction that we're building at, right? And so I talked about the rise of managed services, right? And how we're kind of up-leveling the services that customers are consuming on the platform. Another good example of this is the way that we think about compute, right? So early on, we really thought about compute mainly in the terms of EC2 instances, right? And that was our compute engine And that's the way that we did calculations and computation. That changed with containers, right? Containers were a different way of thinking about that, right? It was much less about the physical hardware, more so about a container that you could operate in, which enabled transportability and other kind of features like that. With the introduction of Lambda, right, a few years back, that introduced serverless computing, right? A whole new paradigm. You're not thinking about the execution apparatus at all. You're just simply figuring out, what actions do I need to have executed based on triggers that are happening within my application. You'll see the same trend happening in other spaces too. So for example, in the application development environments, you've seen products like AWS Amplify, right? And this enables customers to build secure, scalable, full-stack applications that leverage best practices based on serverless architectures, right? So this not only accelerates your software development, but it helps you build, it makes a lot of decisions for you. It helps you build resilient systems. With the availability of products like Amazon Honeycode, this is yet another level of abstraction up from that, right? So you can use graphical tools to orchestrate how you want your application to behave, right? You can figure out the business logic, you can figure out the user interface, you can figure out the data schemas and so on, all by drag and drop, very similar to kind of operating a spreadsheet, if you will, right? And that's important because that enables a much broader class of people to develop applications on the cloud, right? And that'll change the way that we think about application development as architects. And lastly, we talked about specialization, right? The AWS platform continues to evolve and introduce more and more services. And the need for specialized skills relating to those technology areas will continue, right? And they'll get more granular. So there's a couple ways we're assisting with that, right? In terms of our digital training offering, you will see that follow a similar path, right? You'll get more and more granular modules. You'll have training that could be 10 minutes on demand whenever you have time to take it, and be deeply specialized in a particular technology area or practice. You'll see this in the media series technical assets that we produce, right? So we have a series called This Is My Architecture that you can watch to see how other partners and other customers have built applications or what architectural approaches they've taken. This too will continue to get granular. So you can do a search and find someone who has done, how have I architected my, storage systems, for example, or I'm a medical provider. Give me examples of medical providers who have built architectures on AWS. So again, the specialization trend will continue, and the best thing to do is to embrace that. So I'd like to conclude my talk leaving you with some helpful resources. First of all is the AWS Architecture Center. This should be your first stop for anything architectural. All of our technical resources are collected here and linked to you from here, and it has a very good search capability where you can find specifically what you're looking for. The second location is the Well-Architected Framework site. Here you'll find a lot of information such as white papers on the framework itself, the pillar definitions, and those evolve, I've mentioned. Over time, you'll find all the lenses that we've published, and we continue to publish new lenses. And you will also find links to the tooling and training that we make available to help you develop your well-architected practice. Third, we have our solutions library. So I showed a few things we produce: our solution implementations, our solution constructs, our consulting offers. Everything related to solutions you'll find at that location. And then finally, I made reference to our training and certification efforts at AWS. We have a very rich library of digital training content that you can take on demand. Most of it's free. And you also find links to the certification capability. So if you want to demonstrate your competence in a particular technical area, we have practice exams and certification links to help you do that as well. So that concludes our talk. I want to thank you for spending this time, and I'm looking forward to continuing to build with you on the AWS platform.